Good morning. Glad everyone's here today. Hope you had a good holiday weekend. That's still going on, that we got one more day to go through. Continuing in Jonah. We got through the first 3 chapters. I was kind of hoping to stretch this out 6-8 weeks, but I can't do that. We're 3 weeks into it. We're through the first 3 chapters. Covered a lot of ground on a lot of different aspects, more than the typical guy got swallowed by a great fish story. And when I started reading Jonah, it's like, who is this book about? What is it about? Is it about the Ninevites repenting? Is it about Jonah not doing what he should do? And when I got through the whole book, which we're hopefully get through today, there's a bigger story to it that I came away with, and I can see it here at the end of chapter 3 as well. The biggest takeaway I have from the book of Jonah right now is what we're learning about God. Because, what's that? What I've learned so far, and what I'm taking away so far, is what we've learned about God. Not necessarily what we've learned about Jonah or what we've learned about the Ninevites. It's what we've learned about God. And we've got this prophet that's supposed to be doing what God asked, doesn't do it. But yet God was compassionate and spared him. Even though Jonah did what he did, God spared him. God had a plan for Jonah. And he wasn't going to let Jonah interrupt that plan. And the Ninevites, which were a very wicked people, which were a thorn in the Israelite side, God had that opportunity to wipe them out. But they repented, and God spared them. Even though they repented, he could have still wiped them out if he wanted to, because he didn't say, if you repent, I will spare you. But God was showing his grace and mercy to them. And you could say, well, the Ninevites were some of the people that they deserved to be wiped out. Well, why do they deserve it over somebody else? They didn't do what God asked, but so did Jonah. Was their sins greater than his? I mean, throughout the little stories in line in the book of Jonah, we see God always showing his grace and mercy to Jonah, to the Ninevites. And that's something I really picked up through this verses. A guy got swallowed by a fish, and 120,000 people were saved. I'm seeing more and more God's handiwork in through the whole book, and that's what I've been trying to take away from this, and hopefully relaying some of that on to you. Last week I talked about second chances, how Jonah got the second chance. The Ninevites got a second chance. We get second chances. And there's going to come a time where God's going to lose his patience, and there's no longer going to be that second chance. There's going to be that point of no return. And there's a couple of examples of that in the Bible. Think about the time of Noah. I mean, we're into Genesis chapter 6, and God's already saying, I'm sorry that I made the man and put him on the earth. Wow. He's sorry that he did that. Then he goes on in verse 7 of chapter 6, and he says, "For I regret that I made them." God was that disappointed, that upset, because man was so sinful, he regretted that he made them. And we know the rest of the story of the book of Jonah. They got on the ark, which God planned the ark, told them how to build it. God told them who to put on it, what to put on it, how many to put on it. We know the whole plan there, and the rest of the earth, people, animals, vegetation, all wiped out. God was done. His patience were fed up. There was a point of no return. Then again, Sodom and Gomorrah. God got fed up again. His patience were there. And we know the story. Let me find 50 people. No. If we find 45, 40, 30, 20, 10, trying to get it down to a number of good people to save the city. Couldn't find it. God's patience will run out. And we know what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. They were wiped out. But it didn't happen to Nineveh here. Nineveh repented. God still had his patience there. And at some point, God's going to run out of his patience for mankind again. And we don't know when that day is coming, but we know Jesus is going to come again. And God's going to have enough, and he's going to send his son to take us home. After seeing that the Ninevites repented at the end of chapter 3, 120,000 people, roughly the size of the city, one would think that the story's over. God's man didn't do what he said. He prayed, he turned, he did what he said, and the people repented. Good place to close the book. The story's over. Great story if you end it there. But now we're going to start getting into chapter 4 and see, well, it's not quite as happy ending as we once thought. Well, is it for the Ninevites? No, we're pretty much done with them. We only hear of them one more time in the book of Jonah, right at the very end. The rest of Jonah chapter 4 is all about Jonah and what's going on with him. And we also see kind of what the purpose of the story of Jonah is. We're going to get some questions answered. Why was Jonah running? I kind of posed that at the beginning. Was he afraid of the Ninevites, or what was the reason? We're going to see, why would Jonah rather die as he prayed than obey God? We'll see that, is God running out of patience with Jonah again? And we're going to see really what the mission of God is in the book of Jonah. We're going to get a couple of these questions answered at the very end by the time we're done with the book today. Any comments so far? Quiet group today. That means we're either going to get done early, or you're going to hear a lot of talking coming from me. Let's get into chapter 4. We'll start with verse 1, go through verse 3, and then we'll continue on into after that. Jonah chapter 4, verse 1. But it greatly displeased Jonah, and he became angry. Then he prayed to the Lord and said, "Please, Lord, was this not what I said when I was still in my own country? Therefore, in anticipation of this, I fled to Tarshish, since I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in mercy, and one who relents of disaster. So now, Lord, please take my life from me, for death is better to me than life." Wow. Life is that bad for you, you'd rather die? 120,000 people just changed their ways because of the message God delivered through you, and he'd rather die. That tells you how much animosity, how much hate he had for the Ninevites, because they changed their ways. Now, with some of this anger that he says, is it directed at God because God is a compassionate God? Because God relented and didn't destroy Nineveh? Where is Jonah putting this anger? And it's called a prayer. In verse 2 it says, and then he prayed. This is more like a complaint than a prayer, in my mind. Jonah's saying, look, I'm angry, I'm displeased, and I told you when we talked the first time, I'm not the guy for this. They're not going to change. Oh yeah, and I know you are a compassionate God. And I know you are gracious. So Jonah knew all these things from chapter 1. He knew that God might change his mind and save them. He knew that God is a compassionate God. Why didn't he know, let me rephrase that, why didn't he accept the fact that he couldn't run from God in chapter 1? If he knew all these other things about God, he knew very well down deep that he can't change God's plan. He knew down deep that God would know where he's at when he's running. What's going through this guy's mind? What is his mindset that I'm just angry at this now? I don't want to put him on a higher plane or a pedestal being a prophet. But you would think somebody that knows God like he would know God would understand and accept these things. But he's human, just like us. We have good days, we have bad days, we have times that this just isn't right. This isn't going well for me. Why do good things happen to bad people? I mean, all these things can be going through Jonah's mind after the fact that these 120,000 people were saved. But he voiced his displeasure with God in his prayer. Now, did the anger come across at God? Part of it, I think he is angry at God for saving the Ninevites. Yes, Bill?
I think part of it is he wanted his word to be powerful and they repented, and so he's not getting what he said was going to happen. You know, he didn't think they were going to repent, so they were going to be destroyed, and now he looks like a fool.
He looks like a fool going through.
Which, you know, it's like, well, I'd rather be dead than, you know, look like a fool in front of these people. You're right, he hates them that much, but he doesn't want them to be looking down on him. He'd rather be the one looking down on the Nineveh.
So he's trying to take the glory right now, in a way.
I think it's a little bit pride.
It could very well be. I mean, pride is the downfall of man. I mean, it could very well be that he's taking it as, you know, if I would have went and preached this story, preached this message to him, you know, I'm coming out a fool because God's a compassionate God, not going to do what he says. Very, very possible. Ted first, then Tom. I saw his hand up higher.
I'm taller. I think right from the very beginning, he didn't want to do this, not just because he was scared, like we usually think. He didn't want to do this because he was Jewish and they weren't. He didn't think they deserved it.
Tom, then I'll comment on yours.
Mine's a little bit like that. I was just going to say sometimes people see other folks' sins as much more grievous than their own. So it's hard for us to see things, hard for Jonah to see things through the eyes of God, because in his mind the Assyrians were wicked and evil, and maybe, I'm not saying he thought he was perfect or anything, but he saw the Jewish plight versus the sort of Gentile or the Assyrian plight. And so it's easy for him to dismiss maybe his shortcomings and keep score on the ones that he has a different opinion about.
Almost like he deserves it and they don't. I mean, discriminatory in his teachings.
I don't think he wanted to convert it.
I would agree with that. I don't think he did. I believe Jonah wanted to see them wiped out. I think Jonah wanted to see the destruction of Nineveh. I really believe so. And that's sad. I mean, it's sad to want people eliminated because you hate them so much. I mean, that's a trap that we can fall into very easily. I mean, you see it in the headlines, but in our own, let's keep it into a smaller, personalized, cliques in the neighborhood, cliques with family. I hear families that don't talk to each other because one family member said something to another and they hate each other so much, and it is a true hate. They wish that nothing good happens to them. And Jonah, just despised the Ninevites, as Ted and Tom and Bill were saying, that he didn't want them converted. He didn't want to see anything good happen to them. It goes back to what I said a moment ago. Why is something good to happen to somebody so bad? That is very, very common with people today.
But if we look at it from another standpoint, this is another hint from various places in the Old Testament that not only were the Jews, but the Gentiles were going to be subject to salvation. There's lots of those, starting all the way back to Lot. Forward.
We just touched on Sodom and Gomorrah, but we didn't get into Lot or anything like that. But yes, I mean, we see it through the entire Bible. That's what's great.
Well, not even for Sodom and
No,
Gomorrah.
before that.
In Lot's case, we're talking about where his family went after they left.
Where they dispersed to.
Well, who they were. I mean, his grandsons and what was said about them in the Old Testament. It's another study. We mentioned it a little bit when we were in Genesis years ago. But what I'm saying is that I'm not trying to compare it to Sodom and Gomorrah as much as I'm trying to compare it to the fact that there are places in the Old Testament where the Gentiles, there's hints and clues given to people that salvation is not just for the Jews, that eventually it's what it's supposed to be for, is all mankind. And then we get to see that fulfillment, of course, is the whole Jesus came in the New Testament, the day of Cornelius' house was converted.
That's where we have to look at the Bible as a whole book, not individual stories, not individual chapters. It's the whole book. Because we just looked at the Old Testament, we would see part of it. We just look at the New Testament, we would see part of it. We wouldn't get the whole story to put that salvation is for all, not just the Jews, not just the Gentiles.
In other words,
It's-
put it in that bigger frame. Jonah was just as resistant to preaching to the Ninevites and upset that they were converted as Peter was resistant to Cornelius and
it's-
had to see the sheets and had to see the dream and had to go over there and had to see the Holy Spirit fall on top of him. Same comparison.
Same comparison. Two similar stories, but, same comparison at that point. One Old Testament, one New Testament. Thank you for all the comments. Keep them coming. Anything else as we keep going? In verse 2, as he prayed to the Lord, there's three things that stick out. And when you're praying to God, when I pray to God, I can't say for you, I try not to use the word I, because I'm making that prayer about me. Whether we're asking for God for something, it's all about Him. When I'm thanking for something, it's all about Him. But Jonah in his prayer, he starts off, what I said. And it's like he's trying to correct God. Remember when, chapter 1, when we first talked, I'm not the guy for this. I don't want to go, is the implication that we're getting. There's more than the text that we see in chapter 1 when God asked Jonah to go. They had more of a conversation than what we read in verse 2 of chapter 1. Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness come up before me. There's more to the conversation that Jonah and God had other than those words, by what Jonah is saying here in chapter 4. Because Jonah's saying, this was just not what I said when I was still in my own country. Jonah didn't want to go. And he's telling God that he didn't want to go. And it's like he's trying to correct God. God, I told you, you're making the wrong choice here. I'm not the man for this job. I don't want to go. I shouldn't be going to that. But we can see that Jonah's saying this by looking at the whole story here, that he didn't want Nineveh shown mercy. He wanted to see the judgment on him. So he even if he would have went at that time, he wouldn't have put his whole heart into it. Jonah didn't want to go because he wanted to see Nineveh destroyed. And he was saying he's the wrong man for the job, and he wanted God to conform to what God was saying. You guys are going to be destroyed. That's what Jonah wanted. And he was saying it's, I said, in his prayer in chapter 4. Then he goes on to say, I fled. Okay, you going to hide from God? You already said that God knows what's going on. God's compassionate. You know that God's going to know where you're at. But when he's saying, I fled, Jonah's admitting. Jonah is actually admitting here that he refused God's request to go. He chose to turn about and go the other way. So he's still complaining to God that here in chapter 4 that I told you before, not going to do this. And he refused to participate in what God wanted done by leaving. And there's no doubt about it that God's going to get his way. God has his plan, and there's nothing we can do to change his plan. And it's like a little kid. Not that I did this when I was little. When my mom or dad asked me to do something, I'd never sit and pout on the floor. I'd never do that. I'd go to a different room. And then when there was so much, I don't want to say anger, when I had enough of it, when Mom said, I'll give you the count of 3 to do what I'm telling you, I knew Mom had lost her patience. I knew at that point I had to do what Mom said. And it was 1, 2, 3, and I started moving. But Jonah wasn't like this. God didn't do the 1, 2, 3. Jonah just, okay, you tell me to go? I'm going this way. And he did the exact opposite of what God was saying. And he's saying it, and in his prayer, sir, I fled to Tarshish since I knew. 3 times in this prayer, he's saying, I. I said, I fled, and now he's saying, I knew. And Jonah's mad because he knows God's good. What did Jonah know when God came to him the first time? What is Jonah saying here? I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and mercy, and one who relents of disaster. What does that mean? The goodness of God. In the back of his mind, he knows there's a good shot Nineveh is going to be spared. These people that I hate can be saved if I go. God's a merciful God. He's compassionate. He's slow to anger. I mean, he even admits it in the rest of it. You are gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abundant in mercy. These people that are so wicked and so evil, that have been a thorn in Israel's side, the people that I hate, oh, you're going to save them if I go. I can just see him doing that. The whole time he's walking to Nineveh, he's just doing this. Man, he's going to save them. I mean, how can he deliver the message that God wants being like that? But after his prayer from the belly of the fish, he had a change of heart. And he did go, and we know what happens. But Jonah knew what God could do. Jonah knows what type of God God is. We know what type of God God is. We know what God can do. Yet sometimes we're still the same way, dragging our feet, acting like a little kid because we're not getting our way with something that we asked of God. Or something good happens to bad people and something bad happens to us. Are we the kind that pouts around like that too? So we just need to keep our heart and eyes and ears open to everything that the message that God's given us, and not put our own desires in front of God's. And that's what Jonah wanted. Jonah wanted his desire for those people to be wiped out. But that wasn't God's plan. God's plan wasn't to destroy Nineveh. And through the whole book of Jonah, a lot of people think the focal point is saving of Nineveh, is Jonah doing what God says, but it gets deeper than that to what I believe what the message here for us to take away from Jonah is. Going on with the rest of his prayer in verse 3. So after he, I don't want to say chastise God, but gets his anger and complaints out to him, in verse 4 he says, "Take my life from me, for death is better to me than to life." This whole nation just repented, but Jonah still thinks it's better for him to die than to see what's going on with Nineveh. Jonah had a heart issue at this point. It's still the hate and fear and anger toward the Ninevites that's rooted in his heart. He might be willing on the outside to go to Nineveh to preach the lesson, but on the inside it still looks like he's kicking and screaming and dragging his feet, that he's still, you save these people, I just can't stand to see them. I just can't stand for this to be happening. I can't stand for this grace to be extended to these people that I believe don't deserve it. And Jonah's missing the mark of what God's plan here is for Nineveh, and yet what God's plan is here for Jonah. I believe that Jonah's the one that's going to be learning the lesson here, not the Ninevites, through this whole book here. And Jonah's complaint is God showing his mercy to the Ninevites, but yet he's not grasping that God showed it to him as well. God showed it to him in the belly of the fish. When he got thrown over from the ship, he should have died like that the way the storm was. When he got swallowed up, he should have died like that. I mean, God showed that same mercy and grace that he's complaining about that was shown to the Ninevites. He's complaining about that, but yet it was shown to him as well. Any questions? Comments? Okay, we'll continue on. Verse 4. This is kind of where God's confronting Jonah. But the Lord said, "Do you have a good reason to be angry?" No. Pretty simple answer. There's never a good reason to be angry like that. But God does that a lot. God asks us questions not to learn about us, but for us to learn about us. God's asking him, do you have a reason to be angry? Not why are you angry? Do you have a good reason to be angry? What could he come up with? Nothing. He couldn't come up with anything. But like I said, God asks us questions for us to learn about ourselves. And we can see that throughout the Bible. In Genesis, he says, "Where are you? Who told you that you were naked? What is this that you have done?" He's talking about Adam and Eve. He's trying to get them to recognize what they did. Jonah, do you got a good reason to be angry? Jonah, what have you done? We see, who do you say that I am in Matthew? When people are saying, Jesus, who do you say you are? Jonah, you got a reason to be angry? Again in Matthew, what do you want me to do for you? Is Jesus saying. In Luke, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? He's asking these people all these questions, not to get the answer to that question, but for them to look in their heart to answer what is their relationship with God. Then in Acts 9, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? That's a big one. One of the most popular characters in the New Testament. Saul, who is Paul, why are you persecuting me? How he became such a great force for Jesus. And yet, he wasn't asking him, why are you persecuting me? He's wanting Saul to look inside his heart. He's wanting him to look deep inside of what he's doing, just like he's asking Jonah. He's not asking why you're angry. He's saying, look inside, Jonah. What's up with you? What do you need to do? What do you need to change? Is it right for us to be angry, like Jonah was? Say that again, Bob.
Be angry,
But not like Jonah was? Can we be angry at God? Should we be angry at God? Two different answers. We can. I'm not going to go to those. Should we? But yes, we can. But when we are angry at God, what do we need to do? We need to repent. I mean, because we can't let that anger brew and keep building and festering. Tom?
I was just thinking that we would go through this about sort of the comparisons between Jonah and Job. If you think about Job, Job doesn't understand that Satan has requested the ability to afflict him. So he's kind of sitting there going, like, God, I didn't do anything to deserve this. And so I think a lot of times, Jonah and Job and all the others that you mentioned, we don't understand God's purpose. God never,
I mean, that's the big key there, like you said, Tom, not knowing, because if Jonah knew that God had a plan, if Job knew that God wasn't the one testing him, if he knew that God had him, he was safe with God, he might have responded different. If we knew that if we're going through a heavy illness and that at the end, I'm going to be fine at the end of it, we're going to respond and act differently through that whole situation. No matter what type of situation, if we already know the outcome, we will respond differently through the whole situation. If we knew, if we saw and had physical proof of things, our outlook on it would be different. Our faith wouldn't be nowhere near as strong. That's the point I was trying to get across. If we had the physical proof, the physical being, our faith would not be as strong in things. Because the faith is the belief which is inside us versus the physical. This is a pen. I have a pen up here. You all see it. Now I can say, I have a pen up here. Well, does he or doesn't he? I can't see one. I mean, it's something simple as that.
But, as John Campbell used to say, on a need-to-know basis, you don't need to know.
That's true. You're right. I mean, it's God's plan. It's not our plan. It was God's plan for Jonah to go to Nineveh. Jonah didn't need to know whether they'd be destroyed or not. Just go and preach. That's all it was. And it's need-to-know basis. I mean, sure, he tells me it all the time. I'll tell you what you need to know. Okay. You don't raise your hand. You know what's true. Where are we going? I'll tell you when we get there. We don't always need to know what God's plan is. We just need to follow it. We need to believe that he has the best things planned for us and follow what he's got for us. Even though the world's going to be tough, go through it. I mean, the Israelites, they had to go through the Red Sea. God didn't make it disappear. He parted it. God didn't let them walk through on muddy ground. It was dry ground that they walked on. God takes care of his people. We have to have the faith and trust in God to follow the plan that he has for us. And it's easy to get caught up in the little minutia of things around it, to lose sight of the plan that God has for us. Bill.
I think our view of the future is important because, like Rita, I just talked to Chuck, and we were talking about her hip replacement. And I said, how's she going to heal? So all her pain, she's nothing compared. And it's like, you know what? The pain that she has now, she knows is going to end. And so she can deal with that. The pain before with her hip, it was there, it wasn't ever going to go away. It was the same way. So we need to understand the same thing in our life. The pain that we're going through now, it's going to go away, and we got something better to go through. And that's a simple analogy, but it's true. Our outlook on the future totally drives the way we think about things.
Absolutely. And we don't know all the particulars of our future, if I want to use those words, but we know what our future is after we leave this earth. We know we have a home waiting for us. We know there will be no pain. And that's huge. That gives us something to look for. We know that we'll be with God. We know it gives us something to look for. It gives us the strength to get through the day. Every first day of the week, we take the Lord's Supper to help build our strength in Jesus. Any other comments? Terry.
Get back to verse 4. New American Standard, do you have good reason to be angry? Or the NIV says, is it right for you to be angry? Many, many, many times in the Old Testament and with Jesus in the New Testament, there's conversation. But how does Jesus answer and how does God answer? Many, many times it's not the way that people would answer.
Correct.
In this context here, God doesn't come back and talk about his character, which is what Jonah talked about in verse 2. God doesn't come back and talk about if he's going to die or not. God goes back to verse 1, where it says Jonah became angry. And that's what he talks about, because when people get angry, they say things that they have no business saying, that they haven't thought through. They say it just because they're angry. Which, of course, leads me to remember my children. when my children were angry and hollering, if I said to them, do you have good reason to be angry? What would the answer have been from them? Well, yeah, because I'm angry because I'm angry. That's the answer. I'm angry because I'm angry, But that's not the question. But here God is saying to Jonah, he's not a kid, although maybe he's acting like one. Do you have good reason to be angry? We don't hear an answer from Jonah.
No.
So maybe he didn't want to answer that question because he knew what the correct answer was. But who knows? But God and Jesus on earth would address the more real problem, not the superficial things that people would say, but the real problem that needed to be addressed. And sometimes the real problem is the last thing that people want to have addressed, because then that gets down to, why are you angry in this case? And if I said to my kids, which I don't remember ever saying because I didn't think it would do any good, why are you angry? Because, that'd just make them more angry.
That'd make them.
It wouldn't help anything. They'd just get louder. So finally I'd say, get out of my face, But to me, this is a significant kind of question. Because in God's mind, he's dealing with the real problem and asking the person to get past the superficial down to the reality. And that's why God is God and we're not. Because we have a hard time doing that.
Absolutely.
Sometimes we even have a hard time understanding why we're angry.
When emotions get in the way of things, it clouds our judgment. Like you said, when people are angry, they'll just start spouting off what's coming through their mind right at that point. And they're not thinking of what they're saying, and it's tough, and it's hard to step back when you're angry and see the root of the issue. Not necessarily the root of the problem, the root of the issue. Why is somebody angry? Why are you angry at this situation? And then it's to evaluate yourself. And that's what I believe God, as Terry is kind of saying there, look at yourself, Jonah. Why are you angry? What's the real reason here? Anything else before we continue on? Thank you, Terry. Verse 5 through 8. Then Jonah left the city and sat down east of it, where he made a shelter for himself and sat under it in the shade until he could see what would happen in the city. So the Lord designed a plant, and it grew up over Jonah to be shade over his head, to relieve him of his discomfort, and Jonah was overjoyed about the plant. But God designated a worm when dawn came the next day, and it attacked the plant and it withered. And when the sun came up, God designated a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on Jonah's head so that he became faint, and he begged with all his soul to die, saying, "Death is better to me than life." It almost sounds like after Jonah had his prayer and his little conversation with God, it almost sounds like he went outside of the city to pout. I mean, why not go on to the next thing that God wants you to do? But he left the city and sat down under the east of it, and he made a shelter and set it so he could see what would happen in the city. What's he going to look for? God already said it was going to be spared. I mean, what do you think he was going to be looking for at the city? Was he just pouting? Was he hoping that it'd fall back? I mean, Jonah really has a problem here. And I say he's pouting because of what he did. He went out, looked, and I'm just going to sit and watch and wait. And almost do like, told you so, God. See what they did there? They deserve to be destroyed. Like he's waiting for something to happen. And it says, so he could see what would happen in the city. And God, as gracious as he is, designated a plant, just like he did the great fish, and it grew up over Jonah to be shade over his head. Jonah, you want to sit here in the heat? Let me put a plant here to give you some comfort. And Jonah, one of the first times, was happy. He was overjoyed about the plant. Can you imagine that? He wasn't happy for the 120,000 people being saved. He wasn't happy that he was saved out of the belly of the fish. He wasn't happy he was saved out of the sea. He was happy he's got shade over his head right now. Amazing. I'm sure it's hot there, but there's a lot of other things to be happy for at this point in what Jonah's gone through. But he was happy that he had shade over his head. One of the few times we hear that Jonah's happy. And we can say that Jonah's happiness is just as selfish as the anger that he has. The anger that he has is at people that he despises and hates. And his happiness is because he is getting some relief and some comfort. At this point, Jonah's being a very selfish person. And then we continue on, and just like God had the fish, now the plant, God designated a worm. God's got a plan no matter what we do. He's going to fulfill his plan. And he designated a worm when the dawn came the next day. It attacked the plant. So, why would God give Jonah so much joy and comfort and then the next day take it from him? What's that? Object lesson. Who's in control? I mean, Jonah, you're worried about all these little things. There's a bigger picture here. You're going to learn this the hard way. Okay, one more comment, then we're going to stop for today.
Sure. I think you kind of covered why he took it away from him. And that's because, this makes you happy, not because I spared these people. Fine. Take it away.
Absolutely. I mean, we get caught up in that in our lives too. We get caught up in the little things. And Jonah, a little plant for some shade. I'm sure there was other places for shade if he wanted to. There's probably lots of shade in the city, but he made the choice that he's going to go sit outside and see what happens to it. He didn't want that. He wanted to be separated from that. But this little plant that made him so happy, a much smaller little worm, is going to make him just as unhappy. One last comment or anything before we close for the day? We'll finish up with Jonah chapter 4 next week. Thank you.